Greetings all, and welcome to part 1 of my Airfix 1/72nd scale BF109 F-4 starter set. I've previously done an inbox review of this kit if you want to go check that one out. In this video, however, we'll be building the cockpit, adding some 3D printed instrument panels to replace the absent one from this kit, and preparing the model for painting. So without further ado, let's get into this one. To start with, all of the sprues and the 3D printed parts received a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil, dirt or residue from the parts, and then I began cutting out most of the parts from the sprue, including the fuselage halves, cockpit floor, tail wheels and the wings. Once the parts were cut out using some side cutters, I then used a file and my knife to sand or cut away any excess sprue, and I used my cutters to remove the headrest that comes moulded to the fuselage. The wings were sanded and then glued together initially with Revell Contactor Professional, and then I ran some Tamiya extra thin along all of the seam lines and sat them aside to dry. I was a bit miffed that this kit does not include an instrument panel, so I ended up 3D printing one, along with a joystick which I'd add later, and some 3D printed rudder pedals which I had spare. I would have also done some side panels, but at the time of building this kit I had not actually designed any just yet. The instrument panel I created does have a slight inaccuracy however for this particular aircraft, since I designed it with the bomb selector panel fitted. I originally did this since on the box art the aircraft is depicted flying low over some burning T-34-85s in what appears to be a ground attack mission. However, I later did some research and found that the unit the kit's markings are included for only flew the 109 in a fighter role, so it's unlikely they had any aircraft with the special bomb controls and attachments actually fitted. Nevertheless, I cut the instrument panel off of its supports and glued it to the fuselage with some super glue. Once it was in place, I cut out the landing gear parts, exhausts and radiators, cleaned them up, and then attached the radiators to the lower wing halves. To prepare the parts for painting, I then sprayed several passes of Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer onto the inside of the fuselage, the wheel wells, cockpit, and the landing gear parts. The primer was then left to cure for around about 12 hours before I'd add any paint. The first paint I added to these parts was some Vallejo Model Air RLM2 Grey for the wheel wells and the inside of the landing gear parts. I mixed 2 drops of acrylic flow improver, 1 drop of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and 2 drops of the paint, and then started spraying it in several light passes. I considered also using this colour for the cockpit as well, since E-Model 109s used it for their interiors, but I ended up going with the darker Vallejo Model Air RLM66 Dark Grey, as I couldn't find much evidence of RLM2 on F or G Model 109s, though it would make sense to me if some early production F models still used the RLM2 for their interior colours, as they might have still had some old stock before they fully switched over. Once the RLM66 had dried, I then picked out the details on the cockpit sidewalls and my 3D instrument panel, first off using Vallejo Model Color Flat Yellow for things like the throttle and gauge faces, followed by Vallejo Model Color RLM24 Dark Blue for the oxygen bottles, and Vallejo Model Color Flat Black for the gauges and the fuse boxes. The raised details I'd designed onto the instrument panel were then dry brushed with Vallejo Model Color Flat White, which was also used for the raised buttons for the fuse details. Vallejo Model Color Vermilion Red was also used on the fuse details, and for additional switches and details. With the cockpit details now painted, I used some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium to dry brush some metal scratches and chipping on the raised details in the cockpit, as well as very heavily on the seat, and a little bit inside of the landing gear bay. Vallejo Model Color Saddle Brown was then dabbed onto the cushion on the gun sight, and once this and the chipping had dried, I applied some Tamiya Black Panel Accent over the cockpit sidewalls, instrument panels, and landing gear bay to highlight their details. The excess panel liner was then removed using some X20 enamel thinners, which also helps it flow more into just the recessed details, helping to highlight them. The panel liner dries pretty quickly, and once it had, I sanded the edges of the cockpit floor, as well as any remaining sprue joints on the wings. The cockpit floor was then glued to the right side of the fuselage half, along with the exhaust and tail wheel, which had to be installed before the other fuselage was added. Once in place, I joined the 2 fuselage halves together, and all of these parts seem to fit pretty well without much of a gap. Some bulldog clips and tape was used to hold the fuselage halves together as the glue bonded, and I glued the wings to the bottom of the fuselage while they dried. I mainly use Revell Contactor Professional as my glue of choice, but to help soften any seam lines and provide a stronger bond, I also run some Tamiya extra thin cement along the wing and fuselage joints using the applicator, much as I'd done with the wings. With the parts now fully bonded, I cut out the horizontal stabilizers, filed away the excess plastic from their attachment points and ejector pin marks, and then glued them to the fuselage. The propeller spinner, blades, base piece, pin and the front of the fuselage where the prop gets attached to were then cut out and cleaned up next, and then the pin was inserted into the forward fuselage piece and the base of the prop hub glued to the pin. The propeller blades were then glued to the base, and then the spinner was glued on top. You could potentially leave the propeller separate from the fuselage for painting, but since the scheme I was doing would not require this, I later glued it into place. The oil cooling intake on the underside of the nose and the two halves of the supercharger inlet were then cut out, glued together, and then glued to the front of the fuselage. The final part I then added was the propeller before I could prepare the aircraft for painting. With assembly now mostly completed, I began to fill any gaps that were present on the fuselage and wings with a little bit of Vallejo water-based putty. Once I'd applied the putty, I used a damp finger to rub the excess away, and then left it to dry. After about 12 hours, I sanded away any excess putty or remaining seam lines using a file and some sandpaper, and then prepared the aircraft for painting by covering the cockpit with blue tack and the landing gear bay with the kit's included retractable landing gear options. To prepare the aircraft for painting, I sprayed several passes of Vallejo Gloss Black Primer as I had done for the cockpit, using a ratio of about 4 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver and 1 drop of Vallejo Acrylic Thinner to 5 drops of primer. I built up the primer in several layers, until eventually the upper surface had a solid and uniform gloss black finish. I let the top surface of the aircraft dry for a couple of hours, before then turning the model over and priming the underside using the same mix and technique. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as that really helps out. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I spend making these videos. And a big thank you to my fellow model maker Riles for buying this kit when he was over in the UK for a little holiday. Next time in part 2, I'll be painting the scheme featured on the box art, seeing as it's the only one included in the kit, and when I did a poll recently on which scheme you guys wanted to see me do for the Airfix and AZ109 kits, you guys voted on the scheme featured in this kit as second, so that's what we'll be doing. And then I'll also be following that on with weathering, and of course a build video on the AZ models BF109F as well. Otherwise though, until the next time, as always, take care, and model on.